This is the fourth session of our Restoration Adventure 3.0, and I remind you that the reason we call it that is because we are on an adventure. The spirit of the restoration is a spirit of adventure, and that's certainly what we're on and what we're going to be talking about for most of this session. The idea for this session came from Kerry Richards. When he was in Florida last winter, he encountered some of this material, and so we thank Gary Villeneuve and the Fort Myers, Florida congregation for the use of some of their material. And again, I have borrowed liberally some concepts and slides from Tony and Charmaine Chavala-Smith and some from John Hamer. I mentioned that I had gotten feedback from a number of people, and I really do appreciate it. I had been concerned a little bit that we weren't having much of an interactive session, but I'm getting some great feedback that people are, in fact, having discussions after we finish each night with their group, and a number of people have taken these issues and these questions to their church school classes and to their congregation, and that's fabulous. I thank you very much for doing that. As I said, I was concerned that this was sort of a one-way monologue, but I did get some feedback from people saying, no, that's good, because we're talking about a lot of things, a lot of questions, raising a lot of questions that people hadn't had an opportunity to think about before. And so they really appreciate filling in the background that way and the context. As you hopefully have noticed, this whole set of sessions has been about more of asking questions than providing any answers. And so I hope that as we go, that you'll understand that the objective here is not to say, here's what you must do, but rather to simply suggest, here are some issues you may want to consider. Here are some things that we need to look at as we as congregations and as a mission center and as a worldwide church look to the future. So again, I thank you so much for the feedback. Those of you who I sent out an email assigning some homework and pointing you to a podcast that was done between Linda Booth and President Scott Murphy. And a lot of that we're going to talk about in the next session. But so if you haven't yet had a chance to listen to that podcast, I would very much encourage you to do so. I will also try and send out another email that has the email links in it. Okay. We've talked all through this about the fact that we have been given counsel as a church that is pointing us to a future that is different from the one that we have right now. I've highlighted here in Doctrine and Covenants 162 that we live in a world with new challenges, and that world will require new forms of ministry. And that's exactly what we have been talking about as we've looked through our response to the world that we see in front of us. The world that we grew up in thrived in a world that understood church in the way that we knew it. We had a whole bunch of square holes, and the world was filled with people who had the same square peg background and context. They grew up in the same world and understood the idea of church. They understood what it meant to be as part of that environment. And so the question was simply to say, is this the appropriate church for you to express and to live out your churchness in the context in which we were all familiar? But as we talked about, today we have that same church, a lot fewer holes are filled, and that's primarily because in the last 20 years or so, we have the same church, largely a similar message, but it's in a very unchurched world. There are not many people that look like square holes anymore. People are different, and so they don't fit a lot of what we have been doing. And that's what we're going to talk about in this session. We then went and explored some of the background as to why that's happened. And in particular, we looked at our traditional sources of authority, the voices that we use to inform our theology. And historically, those have been tradition and scripture and experience and reason. And a healthy, we saw it as a healthy church that used all of those. But the postmodern world sees the world through very different eyes and rejects some of those traditional sources. In particular, when we look at our traditional sources of authority, the postmodern mindset that says there are no universal truths, the mindset that instinctively distrusts and is skeptical of institutional authority, very much says we don't automatically accept the authority that comes from the tradition of several hundred years, or simply the authority that comes from Scripture. But in fact, we learn differently and we experience the world differently. And so we give a great deal more emphasis to the voice of experience, our own experience and that of our group, and the voice of reason, particularly as it's driven by our obsession with scientific progress. So we looked at what does that mean, this idea that there's no universal truths? And we looked at that in the context of this analogy of the umpires. We're trying to get across how this fundamental question of what does truth look like has changed over the last 1,000 years. So the example suggests that a pre-modern umpire simply asserts that there is an absolute truth. There are balls and there are strikes, and we simply discover what they are and tell everybody else what they are. That's what the pre-modern approach to truth is about. God put it there. We're simply here to discover that, to appreciate it, and tell people about it. In the modern world, the modern umpire has learned a whole bunch of science, has learned about perspective, has learned about perception, and realizes that that truth that the umpire sees may not be exactly the same as someone else is going to see, the batter, the fans behind them. And so it's more of a perceived truth that acknowledges the idea that there can be different perspectives and that other people might see it in a different way. But the modern umpire is essentially saying, however, I have the authority, and so I call them based on how I perceive them, because that's my job. And lastly, the postmodern umpire says essentially that truth is made, it's not discovered. That whatever happened when that sphere went across the plate, it is whatever the umpire says it is, full stop. And so the truth is created by the umpire as opposed to there being an independent, permanent, or absolute truth out there. Where we see this is everywhere in our society. We see it in our news, and the media, and cable news, and newspapers. We see it in movies, and TV, and books. And it becomes this different way of thinking is so pervasive that we may well find ourselves participating in it without even realizing it. And in fact, many people participate in that kind of thinking without understanding that that's what they're doing. And so this whole idea of postmodernism that we've talked about probably till you're sick of hearing me talk about it is one that's just this amorphous blob that is taking shape within the community in which we live. Our world is still mainly governed by institutions and governments and countries and all of these structures that were created and made sense and were evolved during the modern era, and now are being challenged and changed and modified by postmodern thinking. Some places more so than others, but everywhere that postmodern begins to butt up against government and business and religion and education and justice and every other part of our world, we see that kind of conflict as people struggle to redefine what work ethic is, redefine what ethics are, redefine what justice is, redefine what enlightened social programs are, redefine what civil society should mean in our world. All of these things, we ask questions about them because when we look through the lens of postmodern thinking, it looks different. Certainly different than what we grew up with. And so when we then looked at what the church had gone through, and we looked at all of the ways in which that transition that we went through as a denomination transformed from the one true church world of RLDS to the community of Christ that we know here in 2019, we looked at all of these different changes of outlook, changes of how we expressed some principles that were eternal, but we now express them in different ways. And we came to realize that, wait a minute, these in fact are a lot of the values that postmoderns uphold. These are in fact some of the same discussions and same things that postmodern people want to see happen in the world. And so we ended on asking the question, in becoming community of Christ, are we actually now speaking this language that we might call postmodern? Have we become a postmodern kind of church in the spectrum of other churches? And that's where I want to start tonight, is by looking at that question of, are we speaking postmodern, and what does that mean? Does it matter for us when we look at it? So some of the feedback, people ask questions about, so kind of where do we live in the spectrum of Christianity? Now, there's a whole myriad of ways that we could look at this idea of a spectrum of Christianity. I have adopted some idea and terminology from a fellow named John Curt that I found online. He calls it tribal theology. And it kind of looks like this. You have conservative and you have progressive. Now, he uses the term conservative and liberal, but I think there's some baggage with the term liberal that I didn't want to bring, and so I'm using the terminology of progressive. He also used more of a political organization where he had conservative on the right and the liberal or progressive on the left, but I chose to do it the other way around, and you'll see why in a few minutes. So the question here, and we really, really need to emphasize that all of this discussion is about Christianity as we know it and experience in the Western world, here in Canada, in the US, in Europe, and so on. This is very much a Western view of Christianity. One useful way to characterize the difference that we're talking about between conservative Christianity and progressive Christianity is to look at where the focus is. Now, there are a whole bunch of different ways you could do this. I am choosing one of them because I think it's useful for us to look at. And so one of them is to look at and to say, conservative Christianity tends to focus more on individual and personal salvation, whereas progressive Christianity tends to focus a little more on community and our relationships. So what does that mean when we begin to split that out? Well, we can see that be expressed in a whole bunch of different places, a whole bunch of different questions. And so if we look at some of them here, so if you look at the one, the third from the bottom, that's titled Transformation, when we ask the question of what does it mean for Christianity to transform our lives, in conservative traditions, it is common to talk about it in terms of conversion. Certainly in the evangelical world, they tend to see that as that moment of being born again, or of being saved, of making the altar call when you give your life to Jesus. Churches on the progressive side of the spectrum tend to see the transforming experience as being a communal one. Certainly in Community of Christ, we much more have expressed an ethic of that we're all disciples on this journey together. We're going through a process of transformation together in community. And in our salvation is found in the reconciliation of all our relationships in that community. Or if you look at the second one where you talk about the idea of sin or humanity's predicament, what's the problem humanity has? In a conservative approach to this, it's often expressed in terms of personal sin. It's a list of morality issues that you do and you don't, you do this and you don't do that. On the progressive side, the problems are usually seen, again, in terms of our relationships with each other. This idea that we're in this together, and that if anyone in our community, if anyone is still suffering, then we all suffer. And I'd suggest that counsel such as we've seen in Doctrine and Covenants 163, where it says, for in their welfare resides your welfare, very much echoes that idea that our challenge as a community, I cannot say, I have no sin, or I am forgiven, or I have salvation, if there are others in the world who are still suffering. And so when we look on a whole bunch of different questions, we see this conservative versus progressive kind of issue, of differentiation. And so that naturally brings up the question that says, so where do we fit on this spectrum? Now, I have to give a major caveat here to say, this is just one approximation of all of this. You could make up 100 arguments to say, no, this one should be here, or that one should be there. This is more conservative than that one is, or whatever. All of those are probably valid. I had to choose one, and so I just take these as an approximation. But I simply want to give you an idea of where we might see some of the other Christian denominations or churches, where they might be on this spectrum as we look through that lens that we just talked about. And so on the conservative side, we would certainly see our Mormon cousins as being on the very conservative end. Southern Baptists, those are the ones that end up in the news all the time. There's a certain brand of Lutherans, Pentecostals, Assembly of God, the evangelical churches, and to a lesser degree, Roman Catholicism. Now, clearly, a church the size of the Roman Catholic Church doesn't just have one spot on the spectrum. There are, in fact, a whole bunch of different expressions under the umbrella of Catholicism that could be defined as being progressive and others that are much more conservative. So we're just trying to make approximations here. So don't get hung up on these. At the progressive end, I suggest that many of the mainline Protestants cover a very wide range in the middle. Some American denominations, such as Disciples of Christ and Evangelical Lutherans, actually are at this end, which kind of is a little bit of a misnomer when they're called evangelicals, and yet they are actually more progressive than some of the others that are down at the evangelical end of the scale. United Church of Canada and the United Church of Christ in the US would be very similar, and in the Unitarian. Okay, so again, it's very natural to ask the question of where do we fit? And as we've already talked about in the last 50 to 60 years, we as a church have made the transition from a much more conservative RLDS one true church narrative to a much more progressive, and that's not a judgment, that's just a descriptor. We're not saying that because we call it progressive means that it's better, it's different, but a much more progressive way of seeing the world as a community of Christ. So what does that mean in terms of as we now look at where we're going? We looked at the whole question of what Church 2.0 was about, but we probably should have much more correctly talked about these as being characteristics of the 2.0 church. There is no magic checklist where you say, oh, if I've got 4 out of 5 of these things, then I'm a Church 2.0. Now, it's true that many of these characteristics do tend to be emphasized more in conservative churches. So the 2.0-ness tends to be emphasized in conservative churches. And it should come then as no surprise that when we look at the list of things we talked about, what were the characteristics of a 3.0 church? And you remember we talked about this idea of being less doctrine-driven, less personal, more community, more so focus on social justice and so on. It should come as no surprise at all that those characteristics tend to be more emphasized in progressive churches. And so you can see across the spectrum, we have different expressions that are more like 3.0 in terms of characteristics than what we grew up in. However, we need to be really careful not to jump to the conclusion then that just because we went through this transition from conservative to more of a progressive, because our language and the values that we uphold can now be the ones that are expressed by postmoderns, expressed in this new world and culture we find ourselves in. We need to be very careful that we don't jump to the conclusion that that means we automatically have become Church 3.0. That's not what that means. And in fact, the question of being church, we can have a church that has 2.0 characteristics. We have congregations and churches that have 3.0 characteristics, and everything in between, all within our own denomination. And yet, for the purposes of this discussion, because we don't know exactly what Church 3.0 is going to look like. We just know that it's going to be different than what we have. We know that it's more than just the list of things that we believe. We know that it's more than just the list of things that we talk about and the words that we use to describe them. Church 3.0, in fact, will be a different approach to doing church. So while many Community of Christ congregations will have 3.0 characteristics in the way that they approach doing their worship and education and all kinds of things. And similarly, some will be very much more in the conservative tradition that we came from. I strongly assert that as a whole, we are still firmly grounded in Church 2.0. Now, why do I say that? I'm glad you asked. We have changed a great deal already. We're changing every day and we're experimenting. The question that we really don't know the answer to is, how far do we still have to go? Clearly, there will be a transition from traditional Church 2.0, as we've already begun to transition from that, as we've transitioned into hybrid forms, such as some of the things that John Dorhauer writes about in his book, if you find that. Some of the new expressions of Christianity that you can read about online. These are places where the traditional lines of churchness get a little blurry as we begin to move away from the traditional approach that we've always had. And over time, this will evolve to something that we're calling Church 3.0. And we know some of the characteristics, but we really don't know what forms it might actually take. That, in fact, is part of the big adventure that we're on. We don't know what it's going to look like. And so, of course, the question then is, where is Community of Christ in this transformation, in this process? I think that we're just setting out on the path. I think we've still got lots more to discover and to learn and to choose. And that every congregation, every mission center, and every field in the church will transform along that path at its own pace. So this is why I think that we're still much more 2.0 than 3.0, because I think we're at the very beginning of a much longer process. Here's another way to look at it, and here's kind of the perspective that I think might be useful to us as we look. An analogy that kind of illustrates. If I was a better artist, I would draw this more as a highway. Remember that modernity, this highway that we've been on, we've been traveling that for 500 years. This isn't just something that's happened in the last decade or two. The Church 2.0-ness has been going along on this highway for hundreds and hundreds of years on a nice, relatively straight road. And it's very easy for us, has been easy for us, to expect it to continue in the future. But what's happened is all of a sudden, we get to postmodern gulch, postmodern corner, and suddenly, in historical terms, it's very sudden. All the churches and all the organizations and much of our society is going, oh my gosh, what happened here? What's going on? Everything's changing as we're suddenly trying to make our way around this corner. And for those of you who listened to the podcast that I had sent out as our homework for this session, you would have heard President Scott Murphy talk about this transition ahead of the church and of all of Christianity as we try to make this transition into something new. And all of the Christian churches, including Community of Christ, are trying to get to this new place. It's kind of fuzzy out here that we're calling Church 3.0. Again, we don't know how far around that corner it's going to take. We don't know how long that process is. But I'd suggest to you that right now, 2019, it kind of looks and feels a lot more like this than anything. I think this picture sums up a lot of where we are. The progressive churches, including Community of Christ, we're at the very front edge of navigating this corner, of navigating this postmodern disruption. And so as we do that, and as we as a church, and as we as congregations, and as we as individuals, we have this challenge of dust going everywhere. We can't see sometimes what's ahead of us. We're fishtailing. We're experimenting. We're trying this. We're trying that. We're over-trying this. We're over-correcting that. And all through this process, we hear a whole bunch of noise. Somebody's screaming. And then suddenly we realize, oh, wait a minute, that's us. We're the ones that are yelling about all of this process that's going on. And we need to understand, we need to see that it's useful for us to understand that this is very much a transition that we as a community are going through in this particular time and place. So if we go back to this, and we look at going through the whole process of getting around this corner, we still don't know how far it's going to be. And it may be scary, but we don't know how fast we're going. We don't know what this corner is going to look like, how long it's going to take us to get around there. But it could be, I think, a lot scarier because it might, in fact, look a lot like this. As Community of Christ and progressive churches have begun to speak to postmodern values, have begun to experiment, we begin to ask ourselves and wonder if more traditional conservative churches that haven't yet begun that process or are actively resisting those change are kind of looking a little bit like this. And they're wondering, where are we going to end up? Where are we going to land? And certainly we can ask ourselves, as part of our experience in our tradition, is to ask ourselves, has the prophetic call to transform from our RLDS foundation or our roots to become Community of Christ, has that positioned us better to get through this transition? And certainly from my perspective, I think the answer is probably yes, that we're in that process right now. And why? Because if I go back to this, I don't believe that this is a quick transition. We are right now on the cutting edge. We are the pioneers of Church 3.0. We're just starting out this adventure. In fact, it may not even be finished in our lifetimes. But what we do and what we choose to do today will set the foundation for several generations of faithful discernment and exploration and experimenting and mistakes. But more importantly, we can be pretty sure that God is not asking us to just go through this transition with a mindset of figuring out how to survive as a tiny, progressive Christian denomination in the world. God is asking us, is even telling us that we as a prophetic people, that us right here, right now in 2019, have been called to lift our eyes up to the horizon, to fulfill God's ultimate vision for the church, for community of Christ. Not just to survive, but to become a powerful voice in our communities and in our world, living the enduring principles and values that our mission calls us to proclaim. We're on the cutting edge, living this transition, choosing our future history, living this part of the restoration adventure. And I don't believe that this is a separate transformation, but in fact is a continuing part of Restoration Adventure 3.0. What we have done so far is just the prelude. It's just the introduction. It's just the setup for the much bigger adventure that is yet to come. If you go through all 5 of these sessions and walk away with only one thing, I hope it's this slide. Because believe that this is what we're being called as a prophetic people to see, to hear, to choose, and to respond. This is the process that we are engaged in right now as this generation of the church here in 2019. Even if we have no clue what it might look like 40 and 50 years from now. What we do in the next decade is going to be the foundation, just as what happened in the last 50 years is the foundation on which we can now build. And that's why I think that we need to think big. We need to imagine that this Church 3.0 is much more than simply a few changes in the way that we do worship service, a few changes in where we do this, a few changes in how we do that. But will represent a fundamental remaking, a fundamental re-expression of the eternal parts of the restoration that we will learn how to express in new ways, not just for our generation, but for many generations to come. So again, if you get nothing else out of all of this discussion, I hope that this image, that this idea is something that will have meaning for you. So now as we think about where we might go in this next decade, where we might go in the next few generations, we need to think about who are the audiences. We talked about how in our growing up time, people were churched. They were the square pegs that would fit nicely into the square holes that was part of our experience. What's the audience now? And there are fundamentally 2 of them. We've talked a lot more here in these sessions about what we call the nones. These are the people who on the census say they have no religious affiliation. It's a group that's about 35%. It's probably even higher in Canada, and it's the fastest growing segment of the population. But when we look at that, what's interesting is that most of these people, the nones, come from a progressive background, meaning that their parents were part of a progressive church, or their grandparents. Most of them come from these progressive churches as opposed to the conservative churches. Because the conservative churches tend to be the ones that people who are attracted to that kind of expression have a lot more definitiveness about things like going to church for their children. Not so much in some of the progressive churches. And so many of these people have little or no firsthand church context. They know next to nothing about the Bible. They know next to nothing about the narratives. They know next to nothing firsthand about what it means to be a progressive church. The perceptions that they have, as we talked about before, have been determined by media, by television, by movies. Many of them are the spiritual but not religious segment of the society. These are people who respond to the internal call to say, I need to care. I feel that there's a spiritual part of me that needs to be addressed, but I don't see a place to do that as I look around at the religious environment. The nuns are many of the people who lack connections in their lives. They aren't joining things. They don't belong to service clubs. They don't belong to churches. They don't belong to this. They don't belong to that. And they have this hunger for connectedness. But that's not the only audience that's out there. One that we haven't talked about yet is one that's known as the duns. The nuns and the duns. The duns are the people who have been very churched. They are people who still take their faith seriously, have been highly committed. They didn't just drift away because they weren't interested. We're not talking about just the millennials. This spans all kinds of age groups. But these are the people who wanted real community, who wanted real transformation, who wanted to be able to have real conversations as opposed to just one-way theological monologues, who wanted to be involved in meaningful ministry as opposed to just Sunday morning worship, who wanted church to be much more, who wanted to get away from the patriarchy, who wanted to get away from the conservative resistance to exclude people who have different sexual orientations and gender identification and whatever other spectrum we use to divide and to separate us from them. And so many of the duns, and this is a significant part of our world, are spiritual refugees. They can come from anywhere. But it's also true that the duns do often tend to come from conservative backgrounds because they begin to say, I can't do this anymore. This exclusion, this patriarchy, this misogyny, all of the other things that are sometimes found in those traditions, as well as all kinds of other organizations. They're saying, I can't do this in my spiritual life anymore. And if any of you don't think that that there are people in that category, I encourage you to go back to the Project Zion podcast list and find a couple of podcasts. Go and listen to the one of Michael Wright, who's the only church member that we have in Italy, and hear his story of being a spiritual refugee. There are many, many people who are backing away and who find themselves suddenly without any foundation in the church in which they grew up. So the question that we now have to ask is, what do we have? What do we know about Church 3.0? There's some things that we can see as we look at how postmoderns approach things. We know, for instance, that this is not going to be a cookie cutter kind of process, that every 3.0 church is going to look like every other 3.0 church, any more than that was true of 2.0 type churches. But certainly, as we look forward, Church 3.0 is not, it's not a franchise, it's not a formula, it's not a set model or a form, but rather it's more a way of being. It's a way of living and expressing good news, of being the peaceable kingdom in the world. And so some of the characteristics that we've already talked about is this idea of fluidity, the idea that wisdom and knowledge and learning is going to come from a whole bunch of places, that it's not all owned by just one organization or just one hierarchy. But learning and leadership can come from anywhere. It's going to be marked by constant mobility of people moving around, of creative disruption as things go online and offline. There's going to be boundaries that are always going to be broken, and the impermanence of membership is not going to be as important as it was to us in our 2.0 world. It's just going to be much more fluid. Much greater diversity, much more exposure to and influence from other religions. We see that now in our world with the influx of Eastern traditions, Eastern ideas from Buddhism, from Hinduism, whether it's in practices like meditation and yoga, from different cultures, from different worldviews and ways of being. The focus will be more on relationships, on authenticity, in a world where everything seems to be fake. When there's issues of fake news, you can't trust the videos you see online because of the way that the technology can be used. Authenticity, particularly in our relationships, will have a premium. And that authenticity will bring with it its own authority, its own power. The exchange of ideas, of self-disclosure and vulnerability will be expected and valued. It's going to be a church of exploration. Just because at one moment in time we agree that, gee, our experience looks like this, doesn't mean that it won't continue to change, just as we have seen over the last 50 and 60 years in our own journey. There will be an expectation that it's participative, that people will be involved in making real change, not only change in the world, but change in what they're doing, that they will be part of the process, that the desire to be part of tangible expressions of faith in whatever forms it will take, of sharing leadership, will all be important parts of that experience. And the one that's probably the one that'll give many of us the most difficulty is a sense of being temporary. Postmoderns are much more comfortable with a lack of institutional structure, with simply creating something and running it for a while until it doesn't seem to be interesting anymore and letting it go. Often the issue is not necessarily with what religions teach, but it's with the organized part of organized religion. It seems too confining when it's organized and structured. And so there may well be a lack of organization, a lack of structure, where communities are much more organic, that simply emerge and dissipate. It'll be an environment where the ethic that we grew up with as we grew up in church was that if something was going on at the church, everybody should be there because you needed to support everything that was going on at the church. And that kind of ethic is likely not going to be there in Church 3.0, which may in fact be more healthy for all of us. But not everyone will be expected or will want to or have to do everything. So, in the context that Community of Christ finds itself in, if we think about that kind of world, if we think about those audiences, then what do we have to say and share with the world? What do we have to say to the spiritually hungry? What do we have to share with people who are longing for some kind of connectivity in their life? Real, authentic community. I always go back to some of the early videos that I watched of John Hamer as he shared in a couple of podcasts, videos that were telling the story, his own story of how he came to find Community of Christ. And how, with his historian's eye, he saw that this painful process that we had gone through of dealing with our history, of dealing with who we had become, of trying to get away from defining who we weren't, all of those painful processes had given us so many wonderful advantages and perspectives and narratives, things that he saw so much value in. But over and over again, he met people in Community of Christ who were completely oblivious to them. And it has always stuck with me. One of the things that John said is that we couldn't find a bushel big enough to hide the light under it. These gifts that we have, these treasures that we have in Community of Christ, are things that are too big for us to hide, even if we aren't even aware of some of the things that we might do with them. We can't find containers big enough to hide them in. That's the kind of church that we want to be. That's the kind of church that I believe we need to become as we fulfill that ultimate vision of who we can become. What are some of those treasures? You know them as well as I do. The blessings of community is one of our enduring principles. The idea that relationships are at the very heart of what we do, both locally in our congregations, nationally. I didn't know what other word to call it. but this idea that we can go beyond our own doors, that when we go to another city, when we go to another place, we will find somebody. We will have friends there. There'll be people that we know. That's a blessing that I have taken for granted so many times in my life. I remember a friend who came with us to church numerous times, to different places. And one day he says to me, I've noticed something about your church. He said, everywhere we go, there are people who hug you. We need to appreciate that there are people in the world for whom that would be a huge blessing in their lives. In addition to that, we also had the blessing of worldwide community. When we lift up our eyes and see that there are other cultures, there are other countries, there are other people in the world that are part of our experience. These are all blessings that we have to share. The concept of common consent is another idea that we just grew up with. We just take for granted. And yet so many people coming from so many backgrounds See that as being a wonderful, wonderful gift, a treasure, something to be appreciated. And again, we experience that at our congregational level, in our mission centers, and at World Church. Not only simply saying, yes, we agree, but sometimes saying loudly, no, we don't agree. No, we need to think about this more. No, we need to go in a different direction. No, we don't want to do that. And yet doing it in a way that supports and upholds each other and the community. We sometimes take this for granted, but it is a gift that we offer to our communities. We have the gift of inclusion. It is so important to so many people in the world that everyone can participate, that all are called. We see that in the fact that we have women in leadership roles at all levels in congregations and mission centers and at World Church. I love this photo of the apostles. I want them very much the next time they're all together at the temple to make a new one, to continually be updating that. Because I've seen the discussions online in the Facebook groups of people who are so moved by what that picture represents, by what that photo means. But it means that all are called. That for people in Central and South America, they see a face that looks like theirs. For people in Africa, they see faces that look like theirs. We have principles of generosity and a way of approaching how we deal with assets and the gifts that we have received that are unique. Again, we just take them for granted so often. And yet the fact that we are transparent, sometimes painfully transparent, that we are involved in building budgets and looking at reporting and determining where money goes and where it comes from. All of these are important facets. Our focus on spiritual formation is a new expression that we have begun to explore even more in the last couple of decades. If we think about the counsel that says that the path forward goes both inwards and outwards in mission. But spiritual formation is an essential part of where we as a people need to go and where we need to be helping and leading in the exploration of what a 3.0 church would look like. And we do that in study. We do that in dialogue. And I want you to note that just to the left of the word dialogue, if I recognize my bald pates, that's Bryce Taylor. And I want him to know that we talked about dialogue, because that's so important to Bryce. And other spiritual practices, such as labyrinth and meditation. We have a program now where people can begin to go on a journey to become spiritual directors, become spiritual companions, spiritual guides, so that we can help each other and offer that as a gift to those who we might come in contact with. Not just making it up on the fly, but tapping into the wisdom that comes to us from other traditions, that comes to us from our own Christian tradition, but in places that we haven't been involved with, and so on. All of these are important parts of that journey that we will make together as part of that 3.0 expression. People care about getting along in the world. How are we working with other people in ecumenical and interfaith relationships? And certainly in an ecumenical way, our involvement with the National Council of Churches and at congregational levels with ministerial associations and so on are all important parts of what it means for us to take our place in the world of Church 3.0 expressions. With Encounter World Religions, we have something that is particularly unique. It is particularly valuable to show our commitment to how we get along with our neighbors, to show that we care about working with our neighbors, that we understand that there are different paths, that we understand that there are different ways to see the world, but at the same time, we can work together. I believe that I already spoke about the Ottawa congregation and our experience with hosting a refugee family. Well, we're the host organization. Part of the money is coming from a Jewish foundation based in the US. It's being administered on behalf of the government by the Anglican Diocese of Ottawa. The middle person that we work with was in fact Jewish Family Services. And then here we are as a group of people from Community of Christ who are making a difference in the lives of these refugees. That's the kind of world that we want to be part of. That's the kind of church that we want to be part of. And a society where we all are working together. Scripture is another place where we have enormous gifts to offer, particularly our statement on Scripture. And if you haven't read it, I encourage you to go and find it on the website and to read through it. Again, we come from a tradition that is always, at least in our lifetime, is not dramatically changed. We have a tradition that says it's not literal. It's not inerrant. We've explicitly said the Scripture is not to be used as a weapon. We call for responsible interpretation and the gift of continuing revelation. But we can often take this for granted when so many people, especially those who are spiritual refugees, of those who are looking for a spiritual home that fits the values that they have, and wonder, where can I find a place that doesn't use Scripture as a way to exclude, but rather as a way to include? And so Scripture takes on new meaning for those people when we look through the lens and the way that we approach Scripture. It becomes liberating. It becomes healing, as well as a place where we can learn and explore our faith. We offer a focus on peace and justice that goes beyond who we are, that talks about, that makes action specifically for including. We have a temple that's been dedicated to the pursuit of peace, that puts it front and center, with a daily prayer for peace that's been going on for these many 25 some years, every day. And at the last conference where we stepped up and began to struggle and to ask the tough questions and to go through the process of saying, how do we as a church, how do we as Christianity, how do we as citizens struggle with the issues of nonviolence in our world? Those are things that I believe are important parts, important elements of what it's going to mean to be Church 3.0. Similarly, the focus on the environment and upholding our principle of the sacredness of creation. And we could go on and on and on. I probably had enough things that I thought of that I could make another 15 slides. And part of our exercise and part of what we want to talk about next time is going to be saying, how do we choose things that we're going to highlight? But Church 3.0 is not just about the what we believe. It's not just about the what we say and the what policies we have. It's also going to be about the how we do things. And I suspect that that is also going to change very much as we begin to look at Church 3.0. And again, what do we have to offer in that kind of world, in a world that does church differently? One of the things that we have to offer is we do small. We're kind of forced to do small because that's who we are. But instead of only seeing that as a negative, instead of only seeing that as something that we have to deal with, I believe that we have an opportunity to appreciate that that in fact is one of our strengths in a postmodern world. That's one of our strengths in a Church 3.0 fluid environment where we try things. They don't work, we don't do them anymore. We change and go somewhere else. It's much harder to turn around a huge ocean liner than it is a much smaller vessel. And that's the kind of experience that we have and have generations of experience in doing that. And more, we're learning how to do flexible. As we begin to talk about how do we do online communication? How do we do online experiences with the divine? How do we use online to do sacraments, to be the interface between our humanity and the divine? How do we use online to create those thin spaces where we can get closer to the things that are really, really important? And we as a church have taken but the first step in that area, as we now have guidelines for how to do online communion, how we as a church, when there are members that are few in number in places scattered all over our own country or all over the world, can still get together and celebrate the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. And you can think of how other people might use those kinds of technologies as a way to participate in other kinds of important events in our lives, when we can share the other sacraments of the church. So again, we could go on and on. And each of us as individuals and as congregations and as mission centers and so on, will need to go through the process of saying, what are the things in that big long list that we do well? What are the things that we see needs in our community that we can identify? And that is part of the process that we'll all be going through. And the question, of course, is, do we have everything we need?
Way too much.
Do we have principles and policies? Do we have assets? Or we turn it around and say, well, clearly we do have principles. We do have policies that encourage us to try things and to experiment and to do other things. We do have significant assets. We do have created and dedicated and gifted people. We do have a willingness to tackle the challenging questions. So do we have everything we need? And I think the question that looms in front of us as a church is whether or not we can actually see the preferred future that we could choose to live. Those of you that were at the CEM conference on the Saturday night when our President Steve Veazey shared with us, I was profoundly moved by the vision that he put in front of us. This idea, as he talked about futurism, the idea that there is a default future that is just going to happen to us if the environment and the context that we have now, if we just have it continue, we will get a default future. But we can also see a preferred future, a future that we want, a future that we would rather have than the default one that is just going to come because that's what's going to happen to us. And most importantly, as he put in front of us that we have the ability to choose to live that future in the decisions that we make. And so I think that that's part of the challenge that's before us, is can we in fact see a preferred future that we can choose to live, that we can choose to proactively pursue? And then we go back to the question that was in the very first session, when we looked at what Barbara Brown Taylor asked us. Are we ready to give our consent to be where we are? Are we ready to be the people that are on the cutting edge, to be the people who are going to be the pioneers, to be the people who are going to skid around that corner of the postmodern world, to figure out how we're going to get to something that's going to look like this 3.0 church that will have meaning and purpose and mission in the world? Are we consenting to be that people? Are we the ones who will actually choose to do something? Those are the questions that we want to talk about in our next session. And I'm hoping that we'll get to be a little more interactive at the end of that session as we look at some of the possibilities. Because next time, we're really asking that question of so what? So what? Given where we are, given that you accept my analogy that says that we're in this big transition, given that you accept the list of treasures that we have, and we can make the list even longer, given what we think we know about the world, about how the postmodern mindset is different than the one that we came from, we still have to put it into action. We still have to say, given all those things, what do we need to do? Clearly, if we do nothing different than what we're doing now, we're going to get an outcome that is different than the one that we might prefer. And so we need to ask ourselves, what do we need to do? But I would suggest that part of the process of understanding our fundamental identity, our fundamental message, our fundamental purpose, is we also need to ask, what do we need to not do? What are the things we need to give up? What are the things that we need to let go? What are the things that we need to not care about? And again, I'll encourage you greatly, if you haven't already, to go to the Project Zion podcast and to find that podcast with Linda Booth and Scott Murphy, because they talk about many of these same issues. And I think you would find that discussion to be interesting and help stir up some more questions, because they ask these same questions. What do we need to do? And what do we need to change? What do we need to let go? What do we need not to do? So that's what I hope to cover next time. So I'm glad to see that everyone's still here despite me disappearing. And I again open the screen or the floor or all the floors to any comments or questions that anyone might have. Go ahead, Mary.
I think when you were talking, Lou, about the characteristics of the Church 3.0, I think one of the other things that I'm thinking that is a possibility is that there could be some changes even in theology. That,
I'm sorry, can you just do the last part again? There's some changes in? That
there could even be included some changes in theology, that our theology could even be stretched. And I think that, you know, it could be a rocky road because there are so many different styles of thought, so many different concepts around that. And I can see where that can, you know, probably have some time of sifting, perhaps.
Right. Now, can you think of any advantages that we have in that kind of world?
Well, this common consent, you know, and yeah, thinking it through and taking the time to, you know, pray about it and discern. Sure.
Yeah, and even just the fact that we've already done that. We've been through that process. And I would suspect that many would say that we really never stopped stretching our theology. But I agree with you that, yes, I would hope that our theology will continue to stretch. We all stood up and sang in, you know, 1960, whatever it was, that we limit not the truth of God. And yet we were pretty darn convinced that we knew what the truth of God was. And yet here we are these years later, and we look back and it's kind of like, how quaint. You know, how limited, really. We really were limiting what we could do. And so I agree with you. I kind of look and say, wow, what could happen in another 50 years? What could happen in another 60 years? But I certainly hear you raising a little bit of caution and saying, that's not an easy process. And again, we've had experience when it hasn't been easy. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And that would be a good thing to add to that list.
I thought I appreciated what Lou's had to say. We've had discussion in our household in the past while about how many individuals are still going to be at the 2.0 no matter what we do. And the comment was that we still need to go and support them even though we're moving out into our 3.0 areas. I wondered what the other people are feeling about that. We're not going to force them to be able to go to 3.0 if they're not ready. It's going to take another generation for them to make it there. We hopefully some of us are going to move to the 3.0, but do we support them in the 2.0? Or do we leave them on their own and move away from them totally?
Certainly, we're going to talk about that next time. Okay, that's going to be a key part of what we're going to talk about. And I think you're absolutely right to raise that. And in fact, that's been one of the things that in my feedback that has caused the most confusion, if you will, and confusion nigh unto consternation. And one of the challenges that I certainly see us having is to say, what does it mean to be a church of the transition? What's it going to mean as we have to worry about, worry's the wrong word, as we care and love and are concerned about all of the people, us basically, of our generation who have grown up in the church and yet who still find the Sunday morning experience valuable and meaningful, who still find all of the things that we do to be part of what gives us comfort and gives us strength and all of this other stuff. How do we make sure that we're not throwing out any of that and abandoning the people who need it and want it, and yet at the same time allowing those who are called to do other things to be able to do that? It gets even more challenging from a jurisdictional perspective, because guess who has all the money? We may not think that we have a lot of money, but it's the church 2.0. It's our generation. We have the assets. We have the resources. And so the question of how do we share them? How do we use them in a way that makes sense to not only meet our own needs, but also to meet the needs of a church going forward, of a church that we may never see? How do we, as people who need to plant seeds as opposed to harvest trees, how do we go about that process and do that? So yes, absolutely, Larry. I think that's a huge issue for us as a church to struggle with and to talk about. And that's certainly one of the things that we absolutely want to have on the list next week. We want to talk about that and try and make sure that everybody who's listening, that everybody who's watches the video understands that those are important questions and those are important people, and that whatever way that we go through that transition, we need to make sure that we're identifying how to meet those needs as well as the needs for the future. So thank you very much for your attention tonight, and I'll look forward to seeing you for the final one in 3 weeks from now.